Family kicked me out on my birthday. Now they want to steal my new home as theirs. Hello, read it. The day my family kicked me out was the day I learned just how little I mattered to the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. It wasn't just any day, it was my 28th birthday. For most people, birthdays are a celebration, a moment to feel appreciated and loved. For me, it became the day my life fell apart. Let me backtrack. My name is Robin, and I'm 27, well, 28 now. I've been working as a marketing assistant for the past few years. It's not a glamorous job, but it's honest work, and I've been proud of the progress I've made. Marketing isn't as easy as people think. It's deadlines, constant creative demands, and the ever-looming need to stay ahead of trends. But no matter how hard I worked, my family never saw it that way. I lived in a small, dilapidated house with my parents, Susan and Mark, and my younger brother, Tom. The house was far from perfect, cramped, perpetually smelling faintly of mildew, and with a heating system that groaned louder than a train. But it was home. At least it used to be. From the outside, people probably thought I was lucky to still have a roof over my head. What they didn't see was the constant strain of living there. My parents had a knack for making me feel like a failure at every opportunity. My mom, especially, seemed to relish pointing out my flaws. "When are you going to get a real job, Robin?" she'd say, her voice dripping with disdain. No matter how hard I worked or how much I contributed, it was never enough. And then there was Tom, my 26-year-old brother. Tom and I never saw eye to eye. He was the golden child in my parents' eyes, despite the fact that he barely did anything around the house. He spent most of his time on social media, cultivating a following and soaking up validation from strangers. Meanwhile, I was the one paying for groceries, chipping in on bills, and fixing the leaky faucets and squeaky doors. But none of that seemed to matter. I'd always been the responsible one, the reliable one. I thought my family appreciated it, even if they didn't say it outright. But as my 28th birthday approached, I started to see things differently. I'd saved up to buy myself a cake from a fancy bakery downtown, a small indulgence in a life that rarely left room for luxuries. I imagined a quiet celebration, just the four of us, sitting together for once and acknowledging that, yes, I was worth celebrating. A few days before my birthday, I brought it up casually during dinner. "I was thinking we could do something this weekend for my birthday," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Nothing big, just us. Maybe some cake." My mom didn't even look up from her magazine. "We'll see," she said, her tone as dismissive as ever. "We might have plans." Plans? On my birthday? It stung, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was being coy. Maybe they were planning a surprise. I convinced myself that they wouldn't forget my birthday, that they wouldn't make me feel small on a day that should have been about me. The morning of my birthday started off surprisingly well. My coworkers greeted me with smiles and happy birthday wishes, and I even treated myself to a new outfit. For a few hours, I allowed myself to feel good. I thought, maybe things will turn around when I get home. But when I pulled into the driveway that evening, all of that hope vanished in an instant. My belongings were scattered across the front lawn. Boxes, bags, my clothes, my books. Everything I owned was out there, exposed to the world like trash. My stomach dropped, and my hands started shaking as I stepped out of the car. My family was standing on the porch, watching me. My mom's face was cold, my dad avoided eye contact, and Tom wore that smug expression I'd come to hate. "What's going on?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. My mom crossed her arms and said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, "It's time for you to move out, Robin. You're not welcome here anymore." I stood there, frozen. My birthday. They'd chosen my birthday to do this. "Move out," I said, my voice breaking.
"Why?"
"Where am I supposed to go?" Tom chuckled, his smirk widening. "Maybe you should have thought about that before being such a burden all these years." A burden? After everything I'd done to keep this house running, they saw me as a burden. I turned to my dad, desperate for support, but he just stared at the ground. He couldn't even look at me. "It's not enough," my mom said sharply, cutting through my thoughts. "We need the space, and frankly, you need to grow up." "Grow up?" I was the one paying their bills, keeping their house from falling apart, while Tom sat around doing nothing. And now, they were kicking me out on my birthday? Consider it our gift to you, my mom said, her voice dripping with mockery. Independence. That word, independence, echoed in my head as I loaded my belongings into my car. My hands shook with rage and humiliation, but I refused to cry in front of them. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing how much they'd hurt me. When the last box was packed, I turned to look at them one final time. They didn't say a word. They just stood there, unmoved, as I drove away. I ended up at a cheap motel, the kind with a flickering neon sign and a musty smell that clung to the walls. I sat on the bed, surrounded by my hastily packed belongings, and stared at the ceiling.
How could they do this to me?
How could my own family throw me out like I was nothing, especially on my birthday? I felt anger, heartbreak, and a deep, crushing loneliness. Tears came eventually, hot and bitter, but they didn't bring any relief. As I lay there, my thoughts spiraled. I replayed every moment, every interaction, every word they'd said to me. The pain was sharp, like a knife twisting in my chest. But somewhere in the midst of all that pain, something shifted. I made a promise to myself that night. I would never rely on them again. I would pick myself up, no matter how hard it got, because clearly, I was on my own now. The next morning, I threw myself into work. It was the only thing I could do. I couldn't afford to fall apart. I needed money, a plan, and a place to live. I arrived at the office early, stayed late, and buried myself in projects. Work became my escape, a way to block out the pain. It didn't take long for my boss, Hannah, to notice. She's sharp, and it was clear I wasn't myself. One evening, when the office was nearly empty, she stopped by my desk and asked if I was okay. I wasn't ready to tell her everything. Not yet. I'm still trying to piece my life back together. The pain hasn't gone away, but I hold on to that promise I made in the motel room. I will survive this. I will move forward. And one day, I'll look back on this and know that I rose above it. I know it's you, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral, though a whirlwind of emotions churned inside me. Hearing Tom's voice was like reopening a wound I'd worked hard to heal. After months of silence, why was he calling now? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, I thought he might have hung up, but then I heard him clear his throat. Look, Robin, he started, his voice quieter and more hesitant than I'd ever heard it. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about how things went down. I scoffed, though the bitterness in my tone surprised even me. What's there to think about, Tom? You, Mom, and Dad kicked me out of the house on my birthday, no less. That's pretty straightforward. He sighed, and the sound was heavy, almost tired. I know. And I know we were wrong. I was wrong. I guess. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Those words hit me like a brick. I sat back in my chair, stunned. Tom apologizing? Tom admitting he was wrong? It felt surreal, like I'd stepped into an alternate reality. But as much as I wanted to believe him, I couldn't shake the skepticism that had built up over the past few months. Why now? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Why are you calling me out of the blue to say this? What changed? There was another pause. I could hear faint background noise on his end, muffled voices, the clink of dishes, like he was at a cafe or something. Because, he said finally, I've been thinking about how much you did for us. For the house. For everything. And I feel awful, Robin. We all do. I let out a bitter laugh. Oh, now you feel awful. Now, after months of silence, you've decided to grow a conscience. Robin, I'm serious, he said, his tone urgent. Mom and Dad, look, they don't know how to say it, but they feel terrible too. They want to make things right. We all do. I felt a lump forming in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I refused to let myself get emotional. Make things right, I repeated. Do you even realize what you all put me through? I had to rebuild my entire life from scratch, Tom. I had nowhere to go. No support. And now you think an apology is going to fix everything. I don't expect it to, he said quickly. I don't know, Robin. I just thought you deserved to hear it. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I was too busy trying to sort through the chaos in my head. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to let out all the anger and pain I'd been carrying for months. But another part of me, the part that had spent sleepless nights rebuilding my life, was just tired. Well, thanks for the apology, I guess, I said finally, my voice flat. Robin, Tom said, his voice soft. Please, just think about it. Think about giving us another chance. I couldn't help but laugh. Short, bitter, and completely devoid of humor. A chance to do what, Tom? Hurt me again? Forget it. I'm done. Robin. Goodbye, Tom. I hung up before he could say anything else. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down, and I realized my heart was pounding. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the screen. A part of me felt vindicated, hearing Tom's apology. But another part of me felt hollow. It didn't change anything. It didn't erase the months of silence, the betrayal, the loneliness. That night, I couldn't focus on anything. I tried diving into work, hoping the familiar routine would distract me, but my mind kept drifting back to the call. Memories of my family came flooding back, unbidden and unwanted. The way my mom's voice had cut through me when she said, "You're not welcome here anymore." The way my dad couldn't even meet my eyes. The way Tom had smirked, calling me a burden. It was like reliving that horrible day all over again. The next day, Hannah noticed something was off. She had a knack for reading people, and I was no exception. After our morning meeting, she pulled me aside. "Robin, you okay?" she asked, her voice full of concern. I hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted to get into it, but Hannah had been so kind to me. She'd given me a place to stay when I had nowhere else to go. She deserved honesty. My brother called. I admitted. He apologized. Said my parents want to make things right. She raised an eyebrow. "And how do you feel about that?" I let out a shaky laugh. "I don't even know." Angry.
Confused. Sud.
Take your pick. Hannah nodded thoughtfully. "You don't owe them anything, you know," she said. "It's okay to protect yourself. To put your own happiness first." Her words stayed with me all day. She was right. I didn't owe them anything. But that didn't make it any easier. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into my work. Every time doubt or guilt crept in, I reminded myself of how far I'd come. I'd rebuilt my life without their help, and I wasn't about to let them derail me now. One evening, as I was scrolling through apartment listings, I got a text from Mike. "How's the apartment hunt going?" "Slow," I replied. "Everything's either too expensive or too far from work." "Don't settle," he texted back. "You've worked too hard to settle for anything less than amazing." I smiled at his words. Mike always knew how to lift my spirits. Eventually, I found a small, one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. The first night in my new place, I sat on the floor surrounded by boxes, eating takeout straight from the container. It wasn't glamorous, but it was perfect. For the first time in months, I felt truly free. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized something. I didn't need my family's approval. I didn't need their apologies or their validation. I had built a life for myself, and I was proud of it. Here's an expanded version of the third part, adding more depth to the interactions, emotions, and resolution. My mind was racing as I stared at the security camera feed. My parents and Tom were standing on my porch, looking uncomfortable and out of place. My dad kept glancing around nervously, while my mom crossed her arms, a familiar look of impatience etched on her face. Tom was shuffling his feet, avoiding the camera altogether. Why were they here? After everything, after the months of silence, after that phone call with Tom, I thought I'd made it clear that I was done. Part of me wanted to ignore them, to let them stand out there until they got tired and left. But another part of me, a small, masochistic part, needed to know what they wanted. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for whatever was about to come, and opened the door. "Robin," my mom said, her tone brisk but with an attempt at warmth that felt anything but genuine. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "What are you doing here?" My dad cleared his throat, stepping forward. "We just wanted to talk," he said, his voice gruff but softer than I remembered. I raised an eyebrow. Talk.
Now?
After months of ignoring me? After kicking me out? Robin, please, Tom interjected, his voice low. We came all this way. Just hear us out. I wanted to slam the door in their faces, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped aside, motioning for them to come in. You've got 5 minutes, I said, my voice cold. They stepped inside, looking around awkwardly. My apartment was small but modern, with clean lines and a minimalist design. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine, a stark contrast to the stifling, cluttered house I grew up in. We sat in the living room, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. My mom perched on the edge of the couch like she didn't want to get too comfortable, while my dad sat stiffly beside her. Tom chose the armchair, fidgeting with his hands. Well, I said, breaking the silence.
My mom was the first to speak.
Robin, we've been thinking about everything that happened, she began, her voice carefully measured. And we realize now that we made a mistake. I blinked, taken aback. I hadn't expected her to admit that. A mistake. I echoed, my tone sharp. Throwing me out of the house on my birthday wasn't just a mistake, Mom. It was cruel. She flinched but quickly recovered, her expression hardening. You have to understand, we were under a lot of stress at the time. Your father had just lost his job, and money was tight. I held up a hand, cutting her off. Don't, I said firmly. Don't try to justify it. You could have handled it differently, but you didn't. You chose to treat me like I didn't matter. Robin, we're not here to fight, my dad said, his voice low. We're here because we need your help. And there it was. The real reason they were here. I let out a bitter laugh, leaning back in my chair. Of course you do. Let me guess, money problems? My mom's face tightened, but she didn't deny it. We're in a tough spot, Tom said, his tone pleading. Dad still hasn't found a job, and Mom's been struggling to keep up with the bills. We're about to lose the house. I stared at them, my mind whirling. A part of me felt a pang of sympathy. They were my family after all, but it was quickly overshadowed by the anger and resentment I'd been carrying for months. And what exactly do you expect me to do about it? I asked, my voice icy. Robin, my mom said, her tone softening. You've done so well for yourself. We've seen your work online. You're successful now. We just thought that I'd bail you out? I finished for her. After everything you've done to me? We're sorry, Robin, my dad said, his voice cracking. We know we messed up, but we're desperate. I looked at them, the people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally, and all I could feel was a profound sense of disappointment. They weren't here because they cared about me. They were here because they needed something from me. I stood up, my heart pounding. I can't do this, I said, shaking my head. I've worked too hard to get to where I am. I'm not going to let you drag me down again. Robin, please. Tom started, but I cut him off. No, I said firmly. You all made your choice when you threw me out. I've moved on, and you need to do the same. They looked at me, their expressions a mix of shock and desperation. My mom opened her mouth to say something, but I held up a hand. We're done here, I said, walking to the door and holding it open. One by one they filed out, their heads low. My mom was the last to leave, pausing on the threshold. She turned to me, her eyes glistening. Robin, she said softly. I'm sorry. I met her gaze, my own eyes dry. It's too late for that, I said, and then I closed the door. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the closed door. My chest felt tight, but there was also a strange sense of relief. I had finally stood up for myself, finally set boundaries. That night, as I sat in my apartment, I felt a new kind of peace. It wasn't the closure I had hoped for, but it was enough. I was free, and for the first time in a long time I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The silence after I kicked my family out felt heavy, but strangely freeing. For years, their opinions, their judgments, their presence had loomed over my life like a storm cloud. Now it was quiet. The air in my apartment was still, and for the first time, it felt entirely mine. But silence can be deceptive. As I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the wall, the echoes of their words lingered. My mother's venomous tone, my father's weak attempts at diplomacy, Tom's smug arrogance, it all played on repeat in my mind. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and let out a long sigh. Living arrangements, she'd said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like we were a family that shared Sunday dinners and inside jokes, not one that had tossed me out without a second thought. I replayed the confrontation in my head, dissecting every word, every moment. Part of me wanted to feel victorious, to revel in the fact that I'd finally stood up to them. But another part, the part that still carried the scars of their rejection, felt raw, like I'd ripped open old wounds. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts. There was no point in dwelling. I'd made my decision, and it was the right one. Still, my mother's parting words haunted me. We'll take legal action. We have rights. What rights? What claim could they possibly have on my life, my home? But knowing my mother, she'd find a way to make it as difficult as possible. The next morning, I decided not to take any chances. I called my lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Anita, who'd helped me with the paperwork when I bought the apartment. As I explained the situation, I could almost hear her rolling her eyes on the other end of the line. They have no legal claim to your property, Anita said firmly. You're the sole owner, and there's no legal precedent for them to demand housing from you. Her reassurance was a balm, but it didn't completely ease my anxiety. My family had always found ways to get under my skin, to manipulate situations in their favor. Even if they had no legal footing, the emotional toll was something else entirely. The next few days were a blur of work and distractions. I buried myself in my projects, spending long hours at my desk, sketching designs and tweaking plans. Work had always been my escape, my way of silencing the chaos in my mind. But at night, when the world was quiet and the distractions faded, the doubts crept in. Was I being too harsh? Was I becoming the cold, unfeeling person they accused me of being? I tried to remind myself of the truth. They didn't come to apologize. They didn't come to make amends. They came because they needed something from me. And when I didn't give it to them, they resorted to guilt and threats. Still, I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if things had been different. If they'd shown up years ago, when I was struggling to find my footing, and offered their support. If they'd said they were sorry for what they'd done. If they'd shown even a shred of genuine care. But they hadn't. And I couldn't live my life waiting for something that was never going to come. About a week later, just as I was starting to feel a semblance of normalcy again, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email, the sender's name making my stomach twist. Susan Cooper. The subject line was simple and vague. Family. I stared at it for a long moment, debating whether to open it. Part of me wanted to delete it, to pretend it didn't exist. But curiosity, and perhaps a small, masochistic streak, got the better of me. The email was exactly what I expected. It started with a thin veneer of concern, my mother's attempt to sound caring and maternal. She wrote about how they were worried about me, how they just wanted the family to be whole again. Then came the guilt-tripping. We sacrificed so much for you, Robin. Everything you have is because of the foundation we gave you. And finally, the thinly veiled threat. If you don't reconsider, we'll have no choice but to explore our legal options. This isn't what we want, but you're leaving us with no choice. I let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow in the quiet of my apartment. It was so predictable, so quintessentially her. They didn't care about me or my well-being. They cared about what they could get from me. I closed the email without responding. Engaging would only give them more ammunition, more ways to twist the narrative. Instead, I called Anita again, forwarding her the email. They're bluffing, she said, her tone clipped and professional. But I'll draft a formal response to make it clear they have no legal grounds to pursue anything. I thanked her, hanging up with a sense of relief. At least the legal side of things was covered. But the emotional side was another matter entirely. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself replaying not just the confrontation, but every moment that had led to this point. The day they kicked me out. The nights I spent couch surfing and scraping by. The moments of doubt when I wondered if I'd ever make it. And then, the moments of triumph. Landing my first big client. Signing the lease on my first apartment. Watching my hard work turn into something tangible, something real. They had no right to take credit for any of it. By the time morning came, I felt a renewed sense of resolve. My family had made their choices, and I'd made mine. I didn't owe them anything, not my time, not my money, not a place in my life. The next time the doorbell rang, I didn't hesitate to check the camera before answering. It was just a delivery this time, a package I'd ordered for work. As I unpacked it, I thought about how far I'd come, how much I'd built on my own. This was my life, my space, my hard-earned peace. And I wasn't about to let anyone take it away from me. A few days later, I got a call from Mike. He's one of my closest friends, and lucky for me, he's also a lawyer. I had mentioned the whole situation to him in passing, but I hadn't gone into all the details. Now that my family had crossed the line, I figured it was time to get some real advice. "Hey, Robin," Mike said when I answered. "You free to talk? I've been thinking about your situation." I suddenly felt a bit anxious. "Yes, sure," I replied. "What's up?" "I've been looking into your parents' situation a bit more," he said, his tone getting more serious. "I know you mentioned that they've been struggling financially, and you're worried they might try something shady. Well, I did some digging, and it turns out they're in deeper trouble than you thought."
My heart sank.
I didn't want to hear this, but I knew I needed to. "What do you mean?" I asked, bracing myself. "There's a history of financial issues, Robin. Tax problems, debt. It's not just that your dad lost his job and your mom's been overspending. They've been digging themselves into a hole for years. And now that you've made it clear they can't rely on you, they're getting desperate." I sat there processing what Mike was saying, my mind racing. Everything suddenly made sense. This wasn't just about needing help or reconciliation. They were trying to find a way out of their own mess, and they saw me as their way out. The thought was suffocating. "So, what do I do?" I asked, feeling the familiar weight of stress settle on my shoulders. Mike was quiet for a moment before answering, and I could practically hear the wheels turning in his mind. "Well, first off, you need to protect yourself. They might not have much of a case to try and take anything from you, but people do stupid things when they're desperate. We should file for a restraining order to make sure they can't harass you anymore. You've got enough evidence of their behavior, those threats, them showing up at your house. It's time to take some legal steps." A restraining order. It sounded extreme, but at the same time, I knew it was the right move. My family had already shown they didn't respect my boundaries, and if they were desperate enough to keep pushing, I needed to protect myself. "I'll do it," I said, feeling a sense of resolve settle over me. "Let's file the restraining order." Mike talked me through the process, explaining each step with the precision of someone who had been in this game for years. Within a few days, we had everything in motion. It wasn't just about stopping them from coming to my house. It was about finally drawing the line. I wasn't going to let them drag me into their mess. I had worked too hard to get where I was, and I wasn't about to let their issues derail my progress. As all of this was happening, I noticed something strange. I started getting weird messages from mutual acquaintances, people who knew my family but hadn't been in touch for a while. At first, they were vague, but then it became clear. My parents were spreading lies about me. Apparently, I had abandoned them when they needed me most. I was selfish and ungrateful for not helping them out after everything they'd done for me. It was laughable, really. The same people who had kicked me out on my birthday were now trying to play the victim card. I couldn't believe it. But at the same time, it pissed me off. I had worked so hard to rebuild my life, and now they were trying to tear it down by turning people against me. I called Mike again, venting about the rumors. "What should I do?" I asked, frustration clear in my voice. "Honestly, don't engage with it," he said. "These people don't know the full story, and your parents are banking on the fact that you'll get defensive and try to explain yourself. Don't give them that satisfaction. We'll handle this in court if it gets that far. And trust me, you've got nothing to worry about." It wasn't easy to take Mike's advice. My first instinct was to blast the truth to anyone who would listen, to tell them how my family had treated me and why I had every right to cut them off. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized Mike was right. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. I knew the truth, and that was enough. Weeks passed, and the legal proceedings moved forward. Mike was a beast in the courtroom, and when the restraining order was finalized, I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. My family couldn't come near me, and if they tried to pull any more stunts, they'd be in serious legal trouble. But that wasn't the end of their problems. Remember those financial issues Mike had mentioned? Well, it turns out they were worse than we thought. After some more digging, Mike found out that my parents had been dodging taxes for years. They'd been hiding money, falsifying documents, and now the IRS was on their tail. It was almost poetic, watching the mess they had made for themselves unravel right in front of them. As much as I wanted to feel bad for them, I couldn't.
They had brought this on themselves.
They had made their choices, and now they had to deal with the consequences. I wasn't going to be their savior anymore. One day, after everything had settled down, I sat in my living room, staring out the window and thinking about everything that had happened. It was strange, feeling the sense of closure. I had spent so long feeling trapped by my family's expectations, by their manipulation and guilt trips. And now, for the first time, I felt free. Mike called later that night to check in. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I'm good," I said, and for the first time, I actually meant it. "It's been a crazy ride, but I'm good." "You did the right thing, Robin," Mike said. "They made their choices, and you made yours. Don't let them make you feel guilty for protecting yourself." I smiled to myself. He was right. I had stood up for myself, and I wasn't going to feel guilty for it. For too long, I had let my family control how I felt, how I acted. And now, I was finally in control of my own life. And that felt damn good.